want to give a special shout out to my friend and colleague, Wendy Joseph. She is the curator at the GAR, the Great Army of They're our neighbor right over on Andrew Street, and she actually helped us with some of the Civil War history that we incorporated in our Black History exhibit. But I'm here to talk a bit today about Untold Stories, a History of Black People in Lynn. I have to be transparent that the project started before I came on as executive director. I joined the museum as ED in October of 2019. I know, what a time to start. And this project actually started in 2017 with some internal conversations with our staff, recognizing that the young people that were coming to see our exhibits, our materials, weren't connecting with what they were seeing because they didn't see themselves reflected in these stories and in these histories. So the staff at the time decided to work with the Lynn community to curate an exhibition on Lynn's Black history. So the project started with the project of the North Shore Community College, an oral history project, where students were interviewing elders in the community, which then translated into a story share day. We held 2 of those in 2018, where we invited members of the community to share their photographs, their oral histories, their artifacts tied to their family's history and family's legacy in Lynn, and that is largely what made up the exhibit. In addition to our own materials, I do appreciate Kabria. She actually reached out to us for those materials when we were doing our own internal research, so it was very timely that I could actually say, yes, we do have something that we could contribute to the annotated guide. And I think this is supposed to be a video. I think it will play, hopefully. Maybe, yes. So these are some of the oral histories. I figured before I start talking about the exhibit, you should actually hear from people who contributed themselves.
My family, we grew up working in GE. There was quite a few of us. Like I said, there was 9 of us. I had 7 sisters and 2 brothers, and most of us worked in the GE. And my father also worked there. And we lived a pretty good life for us, and everything seemed to go well. I guess that's about it. I remember skating. They used to flood the Lynn Commons, and we'd go skating up here every day when it was cold. We had a lot of things that didn't cost money. We played games outside. We played jump rope and all kind of little games. Well, now the kids, they get nothing to do but their computers and stuff. It shows you how much we have come from where I was when I was small. And I guess that's about sums it up.
Well, I'm here because I have deep roots in Lynn, and I'm very much interested in my genealogy, my family history. And it's my grandfather, who was born here in 1911, who instilled in us the important thing is family. So I'm attempting to honor that by researching the history, finding out more about my ancestors. So it was David Fowler who came here in the 1880s from Nova Scotia. I brought in a photograph of 5 generations of my family who were alive at the same time, and it was in the Lynn paper around 1939. So David's father was Reuben Fowler, and he was born in Nova Scotia. And so we are descendants of Black loyalists, which means that my family, the Fowler family, came from, I don't know where, but were fought in the Revolutionary War, ended up in Nova Scotia, and then began migrating back to Lynn. And so David Fowler came. He was a carpenter, and he worked in and around Lynn, and he brought his children. His last child, Arthur, was born here in Massachusetts, in Lynn, I should say.
My parents, David and Iona Archer, came to this country from Barbados, West Indies, settled first in England, owned a home in Luton, England, which is a section of London, lived there for just a few years before moving to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where there's a large West Indian population, and then from there coming to Lynn. My father died in 1979. He was 55 years old. I was just about 15 at that time, and it was shortly after that that my mother began to tell me some of the stories of our family and how we came to the Lynn area. She used to tell me about when my father originally was going to buy a house in the Dorchester section of Boston. He was going to purchase a 3-family house right next door to a very good friend of his. There was quite a bit of racial strife and tension going on in Boston at the time, and very far along during the purchase process, my mother decided she was not going to be moving her kids into Boston into that tension. My father was furious, and my mother was a very timid, laid-back woman, but she put her foot down this time and said she's just not moving her kids there. So eventually she got her way. So we ended up coming to Lynn instead. She would tell stories about, for instance, when my father was ready to buy the house in Lynn, and the real estate agent recommended that my father might want to wear his tool belt when he came to look at the house, because he told him, at that time there were not a lot of black families in the area, and he didn't want to have any problems with the neighbors. So I believe my father did wear the tool belt and bought the house. And she also liked to tell the story of the mortgage agent when my father went to for the mortgage of the home. The real estate agent asked him for the form how many dependent children he had. And at that time, I think there were 8 of us, and my father told him 8. And the agent wrote down 3 on the form. My father said, no, I told you I had 8 kids. And the real estate agent, the mortgage agent recognized that with 8 dependent children, he probably wasn't going to get the mortgage. He looked out the window of the bank, see my father's car with the kids in it, I see 3 kids. And he wrote down 3. Well, my father stopped arguing, and he got the mortgage. And we bought the house on Timpson Street for about $11,500, I think it was, in 1965. And we've been there, the family has been there for many years since then.
Family story in Lynn took place with the arrival of my great-grandfather back in 1870, who first arrived here, actually arriving in Marblehead in 1870 from Nova Scotia. Like many people who came down from the Maritimes, I believe they came to the Boston area looking for work. Because previous to that, the Maritimes was a mecca of shipbuilding. But at that time, around 1870, the late 1860s, the shipbuilding era kind of died out in Nova Scotia. So people made their way here, Marblehead, Lynn, Revere, Boston. This is where the work was. This is where all the factories were, shoe factories, and that's, I believe, where my great-great-grandfather, as he got off a schooner in Marblehead called Meteor in 1870. He came first, and later he sent for his wife and children, who were still up in the Maritimes.
And I do want to give a shout out to Charles, who is here, or was
I won't say, the lady before this, that is my cousin.
Kristen is who I was talking about, and I have no idea what I'm doing now. I don't know how to get back to my doing the work. Sorry. And I will also mention that Steve Archer, who was featured before Charles, he was our first black fire chief, and then he actually just retired after a long career. So we're very lucky to have him. All right, so I'm going to go through some images of the exhibit. The exhibit went on view in May of 2021 and lasted through July of 2022. This is the entry point of the exhibit. Most of our gallery spaces are on the second floor of the museum. And what we really wanted you to feel is that you were entering your grandma or your auntie's home. You have all of these family portraits on the wall. But I think more importantly is we wanted to showcase the joy and the pride and the resilience and the abundance of Lynn's Black history that often a lot of people have never come across before. So we really wanted you to step into this moment as part of the start of the exhibit. We also have a quote by Michelle Obama that we featured as part of the entry experience. This is the first section. We sort of did a chronological history, but being very transparent, this is just a scratch in the surface of Lynn's Black history. For the early histories that we featured of the enslaved individuals that were in Lynn, we used a lot of our own historical records that we featured. We did name the enslaved individuals that we came across in our research, but we also named the prominent Lynn families that a lot of people celebrate. They have streets named after them, schools named after them that enslaved these individuals. A couple of the folks that we talk about is Black King Pompey. You heard about Negro Election Day earlier. He was the first elected Black king on the North Shore. The holiday actually started in Lynn along the Saugus River back when Saugus was part of Lynn. And he was the first elected individual. The holiday itself was celebrated in Lynn for many years and then eventually relocated to Salem where it's still celebrated today. We actually have a map that Alonzo Lewis, who is considered to be the first historian of Lynn, had drawn of Lynn at the time, and it actually features a notation of where Black King Pompey was at that time. We also have some manumission documents, free papers that I myself, as a Lynn kid, and a Black Lynner at that, had never come across. So selfishly, doing this research was so eye-opening because I never encountered this history in public school. I never had a Black educator, and so to see how this history had been so long and so developed, it was just remarkable. So I really enjoyed researching this project, and working with the Lynn community was just such a blessing to tell these stories, because as a white-founded institution and a largely historically white institution, this wasn't necessarily our story to tell, right? So this was just an incredible project. So we have some historical artifacts from our collection that we feature here in these cases. Here is that close-up of that map that I talked about, in addition to a manumission document for a young enslaved woman named Arity. Unfortunately, we couldn't find any additional material to showcase her story. We also have a coin purse that was made in Lynn and was used as part of the women's abolitionist movement. And then in addition to that, we have a printing block that features one of the first churches in Lynn. And of note is where all of the families sat, but of no note as to where the enslaved individuals sat in that church. We also talk a bit about the Ruffin family. They were one of the first free families in Lynn. Philip Ruffin came from Virginia and then eventually was able to bring his wife and children. We actually have their free papers, and that was a remarkable experience as a Black person. To hold somebody's free papers was very powerful. The Ruffin family entrusted what was then just a box of family materials to us a few decades ago, and we've been able to preserve those materials, and we were very excited to showcase them as part of the exhibit. There are still Ruffins in Lynn, which is really remarkable. I was mentioning in our earlier session, one of them works for National Grid, so he checks our meters once a month. And it was really wonderful to have him come in and bring in his family and to really celebrate his family's history that he didn't really know the extent of. So we have some photographs, some birth records, death records, and even receipts from Philip Ruffin when he had a barber shop in Lynn. That's Philip and Sarah Ruffin. We did have to retouch this photo a little bit as it had been damaged previously. We talked about the Civil War history. Again, shout out to Wendy and the GAR. We do have a number of Civil War items in our collection. So we had some Confederate dollars and some tack that was preserved at one point in time, just to sort of illuminate that history. But we do talk about the Lynners who fought in the 54th Regiment that came from Lynn. And then in the later part of the exhibit, we have their portraits, which Wendy generously let us borrow. So thank you again, Wendy. We also talk quite a bit about Jan Metzelliger, which some people may know in Lynn's history. He invented the shoe lasting machine, which completely revolutionized the shoe industry, and the machine itself is still in use today as part of shoe manufacturing. He was born a slave in Dutch Guyana. His mother was enslaved. His father was a white Dutchman. From what we can tell, his father's family sort of adopted him, gave him an education, and he actually ended up in Philadelphia before relocating to Lynn. And he found some odd jobs. He eventually ended up in the shoe business. He faced a lot of discrimination and racism as a Black man. A lot of people did not take his invention seriously. There were racial slurs associated with his invention in its early days. Because his invention did put a lot of people out of work. The lasting position was quite a coveted position within the shoemaking industry, but his invention, like I said, completely revolutionized the process from making hundreds of pairs of shoes a day to thousands. So we talk more about his story. There was a Jan Metzelliger Day that started in Lynn in the 1990s. It's not something that's celebrated today, but we hope to bring that back. And he even has a stamp that we have in our collection that was produced. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot we're short on time. So here's a close-up of that case. We also talk about faith, activism, and community. So we, again, thankful to the community members who shared these materials with us. These images are from a poster board that Pat Darby brought in. She was very active in the Bethel A&B congregation. And so because of her, we have images of previous parishioners of that congregation. We also talk quite a bit about sports because Lynn is very popular for its sports history. So of course we would be remiss if we did not feature stories of our Black athletes. And then at the very end, you see there, we did have a contribution wall because we, again, recognized that this was a very concise version of what we found, and so we wanted community members to continue to share notable figures and moments from Lynn's Black history to continue this work, and that's what we're doing today. Oh, and those are the Civil War soldiers. So Untold Stories is continuing in 2023. We're hoping to open our next iteration next month. We're focusing on largely 20th and 21st century. We are very lucky to have so many incredible Black elders in our community that unfortunately are passing away. And so we are making it a point to capture their histories and their stories, not only to preserve them, but to share them. And so I did bring a little book with me, From Apple Pie to Pad Thai. It's a North of Boston cookbook, but in it is Lily C. Jones. She's one of the folks that we'll be featuring as part of the next iteration of Untold Stories. She was a caregiver to many, many people in Lynn, but she's also an accomplished cook. She still sells her sweet potato pies during Thanksgiving season, so if you're fortunate to head to Lynn, please see her. But we are just so excited to be continuing this work, and I thank you all for hearing what we're doing.